Big opening statement, Black Myth Wukong has possibly some of the best progression in all of gaming. And when I say that, I don't mean the game's internal progression systems, like your skill trees, your leveling system, any of that. What I mean is how the game evolves and changes on a grand scale in accordance to how far the player has progressed through the game. Gameplay progression, difficulty progression, world progression. It starts in a way that does wonders for new players and ends in a rewarding catharsis for those who can overcome the game's endgame challenges. And a real quick warning before we get into this, I'm going to go through each chapter of Black Myth Wukong in chronological order, and each one will have a chapter in the video. So if you don't want any spoilers of any kind whatsoever, this video ain't gonna be for you. But if you just want to avoid spoilers about specific chapters or certain endings, then you can watch the majority of the video and just skip to the conclusion that wraps up everything with only minor spoilers at the end. Now then, let's break down how Black Myth Wukong progresses alongside the player. Let's take a journey to the best. In Chapter 1, the player starts in the Forest of Wolves on Blackwind Mountain, and essentially the entire map is a straight line from where you start, progression-wise. The difficulty of the enemies in the area is extremely low, such that even with no upgrades, you can deal with most of them really easily. That is, except for one. The Wandering Wight will chunk you for a third of your health in a single hit, has an AoE that covers most of the entire area you're fighting in, has a Ki Blast from Dragon Ball Z, and is 100% optional. It's an early lesson to new players that there will sometimes be very difficult obstacles that you can find if you explore, which aren't strictly necessary to beat the game. But they will reward you appropriately if you can manage to overcome them. It's also worth noting that the primary elemental bane that players are going to deal with in this chapter is fire, being used both by one of the first mini-bosses and by the final boss of the chapter. Chapter 2 has the player wake up in Yellowwind Ridge, and it starts off just as linear as Chapter 1, except the linear path has widened considerably. This gives the impression of having a wider open world despite not actually being an open world yet, and it gives players much more to explore while still effectively requiring the player to travel forward in a straight line to progress. The difficulty is also raised with a wider spread of what I'm going to call pseudo-bosses. These are enemies that are substantially more difficult than regular enemies, and to go along with that, they do not respawn after you rest. But they also don't have a proper boss health bar and name. Likewise, regular enemies are now going to start gaining access to what was only available to bosses in Chapter 1, Firebane. In these ways, Chapter 2 serves as a direct expansion to what happened in Chapter 1. It's all of the same stuff, but bigger and more difficult. That is, until you beat the Rat King and the Second Prince. Once you deal with them, you're introduced to the second half of the map, which effectively turns Chapter 2 into a loop. Although it's still almost entirely composed of linear pathing, they intertwine in unexpected ways and give players their first taste of more open world design, and it conditions them to explore in ways that aren't strictly linear if they want to progress and find stuff. Chapter 3 is complicated in terms of location because it sort of kinda starts going all over the place, and it's by a huge margin the largest chapter of the game. If I were to layer together all of the maps of the various areas that you're going to find in Chapter 3, it would look something like this. You're going to start on Snow Hill Path and go down to the Frozen Lake, which is almost entirely linear, the same as how the previous two chapters had started. But, very importantly, this time it's going to introduce the player to the two primary banes of this chapter, Frost with the Macaque Chief and Thunder with Kengjin Luong. Likewise, the bosses that these banes are attached to indicate what kinds of enemies are going to be using those kinds of banes. Frost is going to get used by a lot more of minor enemies and bosses, those who are unenlightened and worldly, but Thunder is reserved for heavenly, celestial beings, and those who directly serve them. And these stupid bats for some reason! After that we get to the prison, which builds on the idea of a linear loop and level design from Chapter 2 by making it quite literally a cylinder. The area is composed of nothing but straight linear corridors, but they all loop in on one another and build in verticality, such that it challenges the player to think in a more open-minded way rather than simply holding forward to succeed. Following this trend, the next two areas are linear in terms of their critical path, but if the player chooses to explore like the last few areas have now conditioned them to, they will find substantial side paths granting story moments, NPCs, mini-bosses, and plenty of rewards, all of which will now reinforce that exploratory behavior. It's only after the player has now had multiple areas to explore that have expanded on what originally started as strictly linear level design that the game finally hits the player with this. Starting with the Forest of Felicity, the rest of the chapter is fully open world, and this area is huge. Even the Thunderclap Temple is effectively an open sandbox. The player is now fully cut loose with the ability to explore to their heart's content, with resources, upgrades, and bosses all over the place to be discovered. Peaking here, the game up until this point has effectively been designed like a cone. The world starts very narrow and constrained with only one solution to progress, but little by little it expands to give the player more options and greater freedom of exploration until they eventually come to a completely open world, all the while introducing new dangers while increasing the difficulty of the old dangers. And that design ideology doesn't stop with Chapter 3, because you can look at Black Myth Wukong as taking place in two halves. The first three chapters establish the game's ideas. The second three chapters push those ideas as far as they can go. In Chapter 4, we see the final form of Chapter 2. It has the exact same template, starting out very linear but wide, until the defeat of a boss will open up the rest of the level, which is a looping linear level design. However, where Chapter 2 had just a singular loop with only a few interconnecting paths, the Webbed Hollow is a veritable labyrinth. Here are all of the portions of the map for the Webbed Hollow, and even spread out like this, it looks a bit messy. But check what it actually looks like when I make it accurate to the real game. Almost the entire chapter takes place in one giant underground cavern, and dozens of linear paths all linked together and intertwined through cliffs, caverns, and drops over top of one another that cause it to be incredibly dense. Despite being linear in terms of the critical path, technically, there are so many linear paths that it effectively comes off as being an open world, just like the end of Chapter 3 was. It's also fitting that, considering Chapter 2 was the only chapter thus far which did not introduce a new elemental bane, that its final evolution should spotlight the last one, Poison. Poison has been used by select singular enemies thus far, but it is the primary bane of Chapter 4. Although, because we're still following the rules that Chapter 3 just established, the powerful and enlightened beings wield Thunderbane, which results in the final boss for Chapter 4 wielding both Poison and Thunder. Chapter 5 serves as the final evolution of Chapter 1. It's essentially a straight line from beginning to end, and just like Chapter 1, the primary bane is fire. However, what Chapter 5 does is ramp the difficulty to an almost comedic degree. In multiple circumstances, the player is going to be required to wedge themselves into a very small corridor, which will immediately be filled with nearly inescapable death, be it in the form of fire from the elemental carts, or blunt force Looney Tunes pancaking by this iron ball. It's also fitting, following the idea that this is the final form of Chapter 1's design, that the piece of equipment that allows the player to deal with all of the fire and lava in Chapter 5 is unlocked in Chapter 1, the Fireproof Mantle. With it, the player gains the ability to just rock up to the elemental carts rather than having to dance with incineration. Chapter 6, by process of elimination, serves as the final evolution of Chapter 3's design. And if you'll recall, Chapter 3 is where we went from sprawling linear pathways to being a nearly open world. With that in mind, here's what the final evolution of a nearly open world looks like. Yup, it sure is open. Not only that, but it also incorporates all 4 of the elemental banes, where all the other chapters were generally restricted to no more than 2 of them at a time, with small exceptions, even including the previous 2 latter half chapters. In keeping with the scaling and difficulty, there are now very few actual enemies. Everywhere you look, you're going to find more bosses that use fire, poison, thunder, poison, fire, poison, frost.
Oh, I'm toxic again. That's great.
But in accordance with the progression of the difficulty, the player has progression to match. After overcoming each of the main bosses, the player will acquire Sun Wukong's full set of armor, as well as his staff, all of which have massively higher stat bonuses than almost anything the player has been able to acquire up to this point. Likewise, by equipping every single piece of equipment, the player unlocks a 4th staff stance, Wukong's form. This is a form that freely uses the extending properties of the staff to grant greater range to your regular combos, and your heavy attack can be any of the heavy attacks or varied combo moves from the previous 3 stances that now all connect in what used to be impossible ways. And having all 4 focus points now grants a brand new, extremely powerful multi-hit heavy attack that only works in this form. And oh yeah, on top of all of that, did I mention Nimbus? By this point, the game has thrown every idea that it has at you and expanded on them to their logical extreme. Along with that, the player has achieved true freedom in the form of the Somersault Cloud and an armor set that effectively breaks them free from the constraints of the game's skill tree system. In this state, you then go on a tear all the way up the mountain back to where you started the story so that you can finally bring Wukong back. And going into the stone that started it all presents the player with a challenge that combines elements from a majority of the significant bosses from the rest of the game. The Stone Monkey, with multiple elemental banes, combo attacks, command grabs, counters, giant AoEs, and a smattering of weird mechanics that no other boss has because they are yours. Your fog walk, your ability to make clones. The Stone Monkey is the combination of everything you've dealt with up to this point with a small amount of you thrown in. And when you beat all of that, it culminates into the only boss that can truly give you the challenge you deserve at this point. Yourself. With all of Sun Wukong's relics, with all of Sun Wukong's powers, and all of Sun Wukong's gear, the only thing left to do is conquer Sun Wukong himself, with a twist. Because you see, the idea of the progression I presented a little while ago about the games being split into halves, where the first half represents the game's ideas and the second half pushes those ideas to their logical extreme, is not abandoned here. The game's overarching philosophy on progression is applied to the final boss itself. The Great Sage's Broken Shell introduces a mirror image of yourself, effectively a shared moveset, all of the same spells, and you even both share the same perfect dodge mechanic. In this moment, effectively, you are both Sun Wukong, but you're both missing something that the other has. And that's shown when the fight transitions into Phase 2. In Phase 2, you are stripped of everything that made you the new Sun Wukong. When the phase begins, the Broken Shell reclaims every piece of Wukong's essence that you've spent the entire rest of the game acquiring. With all of his influence stripped from you, you lose the ability to use Wukong's staff form. Meanwhile, the Broken Shell has become everything that Sun Wukong used to be, filled with all but his mind. After the transformation, he even struts up to you in the same pose that you used to have in the Wukong staff form. And the disrespect this mindless version of Wukong will dish out on your nameless monkey is absolutely diabolical. Yoink. The idea of Phase 1 of the Great Sage's Broken Shell was to present the player with the mirror match, while the logical extreme presented in Phase 2 is to instead have the player go through the same mirror match, but now it's the nameless monkey versus Sun Wukong. This represents the peak challenge of the game, both narratively and in terms of mechanical combat. An ambitious nameless monkey with a destiny versus the legendary immortal god that monkey has been trying to imitate for the entire story. With this, the progression reaches its climax. In terms of the world design and the difficulty scaling, both have gone from very simple and very limited to reaching their respective logical extremes, and in a lesser game, that would be the end. Credits roll, maybe you go into New Game Plus, do it all over again, move on. But this is not a lesser game, this is Black Myth Wukong, and it's not done. Because if you did every secret area and you've beaten the final boss, you have opened the way for yourself to get the true ending. The ending where you don't simply achieve your goal and repeat the cycle of yet another monkey reincarnating as Sun Wukong, but you get to forge your own path, and you avenge the Sun Wukong that came before you. You have to fight. And finally, we get to the thing that made me want to write this in the first place, so I'm kind of just gonna start gushing. Because after you finally beat the game and conquer the two hardest bosses the game has to offer in a row, you are rewarded immensely. What follows is your new ascension to godhood after defying the sucker stab that killed the previous Wukong, and you take the form of the stone monkey that served as the penultimate boss of the game. With the fight that comes after, it's as though the game is saying, congratulations, you've done the hard part. Now you have officially earned the right to mash buttons on a god's face. And it's during this fight that you realize everything Sun Wukong did to you during the final boss fight wasn't disrespect. It was instructions, because you don't merely disrespect the four heavenly kings from the intro, you violate them. Oh look, it's raining blood. Here's an umbrella! It's about sending a message! You UNGA when you should have BUNGA! This monkey's gonna wear your dragon like a scarf! I won't spoil the rest of the fight, but just look at how unbelievably personal this last punch is. To tie everything together with only minor spoilers, Black Myth Wukong progresses like this. Chapter 1 is strictly linear, and its primary bane is fire. Chapter 2 is linear, but much more broad, and introduces non-linear pathing. Chapter 3 continues the non-linear pathing until the game becomes almost fully open world, and its primary banes are thunder and frost. Chapter 4 serves as the final evolution of Chapter 2, with sprawling and convoluted linear pathways, and its primary bane is poison. Chapter 5 serves as the final evolution of Chapter 1, being strictly linear but massively more difficult, while also allowing the player to utilize tools provided in Chapter 1 to their fullest potential. And Chapter 6 serves as the final evolution of Chapter 3, being entirely freedom-oriented and open world, while also prominently featuring all four banes. Then, after the player has beaten the entirety of this incredibly difficult game, the player is rewarded with a cathartic Unga Bunga power fantasy that pays off the struggle in the true ending, and not only that, the game rewards the player for getting said true ending with a secret weapon and a new transformation that they get to keep. Black Myth Wukong has some of the best progression of any game I have ever played in terms of expanding the ideas presented in the world design, combat, difficulty scaling, and even how the game rewards you for playing it. If there's any lesson to be learned here by the rest of the industry, it's pretty clear to me. Reject modernity. Return to monkey. Thank you all so much for watching. Man, Monkey Game was fun. As always, if you made it to the end of the video and you liked it, please consider subscribing and supporting me either on YouTube or over on Patreon if you want exclusive content. And I will see you, yes you, next time.